Hi, everyone. My name is Jocelyn, and me and my group R1 will be presenting the global trend of decreased physical activity and how that increases the prevalence of breast cancer over time. And so first, I'd like to give a brief overview as to what we will be covering today. So first, I will be presenting an introduction about breast cancer and some of its risk factors. Then we will be moving into our popular article before diving into our first scientific paper, Physical Activity, DNA Methylation, and Breast Cancer Risk, a systematic review. Then we'll be discussing our second scientific paper, the physical activity during adolescence and young adulthood, and the risk of breast cancer in BRCA1 and BRCA2 mutation carriers. And then we'll be wrapping up our presentation with some key points. So first, the introduction. So as we all know, breast cancer is the cancer of the breasts, and this occurs in both females and males. Some risk factors of breast cancer include the family history of breast cancer, one's age, as older males and females are at a higher risk of developing breast cancer, race, past medical history of breast disease and the reproductive system, radiation exposure, as that is a known catalyst for mutation, and then dietary factors as well as obesity after menopause for females. So one of the papers we discussed, or one of the papers we read before class, was the et al. Paper from 1988, in which he stated that most of modern day foods are more calorically concentrated than the wild game and uncultivated crops that made up the Paleolithic diet during the Paleolithic era. And so as society continued to modernize, and technology continue to advance, our modern day society now requires less energy expenditure, and therefore we operate at a lower energy state and have continued to do so throughout time. And so this has led to a continued increase of caloric intake and a decreased energy expenditure over time, which has led to an increase in obesity prevalence in our society.
Hi, I'm Joseph Drummond, and I'll be doing the popular article. The popular article focuses mainly on women and breast cancer and lowering the risks by exercising. So it talks about being active in all stages of life, not just their older ages, and how their risk of breast cancer goes up when most women are postmenopause. How is exercise related to breast cancer? Mainly because exercise helps with weight control, and it can help lower your blood estrogen levels in women, and how exercise may boost the immune system of the body so that it can help kill or slow the growth of cancer cells. How much exercise is enough exercise? Around 4 to 5 hours a week, I would say, of moderate exercise is enough. That's walking, dancing could be just anything that keeps you moving, keeps you active, but you should also do about 1 to 2 hours of vigorous exercises. This could be jogging, swimming, HIIT workouts, whatever it may be. And I know a lot of people say they don't have time to go to the gym because their schedule is packed. So I got some tips here that can help increase your physical activity. Some being that you can use the stairs instead of using the elevator. Maybe you could ride your bike when you're going to the park instead of driving, take your dog for a walk, or just join a rec team. Just keep active and keep going.
Hi, my name is Avni, and I'm going to be talking about the first scientific paper called Physical Activity, DNA Methylation, and Breast Cancer Risk, and this is a systematic review. So in general, this study accumulated a bunch of articles that were both observational and RCT studies that talked about physical activity, DNA methylation, and breast cancer and how they all relate to one another. So in general, these studies talked about methylation using line 1 methylation, which is a type of way you can analyze methylation, and they assessed it through the CpG sites, which stands for cytosine, phosphate, guanine, dinucleotides. In general, methylation is adding methyl groups to DNA nucleotides, and this can repair DNA, change hormones, and regulate them, and also increase or decrease the risk of certain chronic diseases. And also these studies use the 450K array, which is a genetic method of testing methylation in general. So in these studies, it was pretty consistent that the findings were similar. There was basically an association that high levels of physical activity leads to high like prevalence of global DNA methylation in adults, and that these DNA methylation levels are like associated with lower breast cancer risk. So this is even more staggering that 50 to 40% of breast cancer can be averted by just physical activity, and how that relates to DNA methylation. And this was also found in a lot of like studies that showed about how like longer physical activity can affect methylation as well. So what are the evolutionary implications of DNA methylation? It's been kind of said in previous articles that specific traits that we have can be explained by gene regulation rather than like a pure protein, and that it's impacted by your environment. So it really like your environment can make a lot of impact on your DNA. And then, so one important thing too is that these studies found that cytosine demethylation is heritable through modification. And this is important because, as we saw before, being sedentary kind of disrupts how our like metabolism was coded for a long time from our Paleolithic ancestors. And so right now it's kind of like modification is leading to increases of chronic disease. So short-term changes in physical activity is not likely to change methylation, only like long-term sustained periods. And yeah, it's been conserved and can have a large implication on evolution.
Hi, I'm Sam, and I'm gonna talk about another scientific paper discussing physical activity during adolescence and young adulthood and the risk of breast cancer in BRCA1 and BRCA2 mutation carriers. And so just as a little bit of background, deleterious mutations in the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes significantly increase the risk of developing cancer from about 12% of the general population to those with these mutations having about a 69 to 72% risk of developing breast cancer. The mechanism that the protein functions in is likely has to do with a higher level of estrogen and progesterone, and we've seen that inhibition of such progesterone has been a good way to prevent breast cancer. And we see that not only is breast cancer genetic, but we see some environmental factors as well, including physical activity. And so the study focused specifically on women who were carriers of deleterious BRCA1 and BRCA2 mutations, and participants were asked to self-report their physical activity in youth, adolescence, and adulthood. And case control pairs were made between women who had breast cancer and those who didn't, and as many extenuating factors as possible were attempted to be removed. And in the end, they found that generally total recreational physical activity and breast cancer risk didn't have a relationship, but increased level of exercise during adolescence led to significantly decreased risk of breast cancer pre-menopause. And that's particularly applicable. That's particularly interesting because women with mutations in these genes are more likely to get breast cancer younger. And is possibly due to exercise reducing risk of insulin resistance, chronic inflammation, and the endogenous sex hormones like discussed before. And so some evolutionary implications, as discussed, non-communicable disease risk has increased significantly since industrialization, like we talked about in class, as disease risk for communicable diseases has increased, non-communicable disease risk has increased. Also, physical activity has generally declined in Western society post-urbanization as things are just easier to get to. And so people now need to be more conscious about physical activity. Now, alongside this, allele frequency of BRCA1 and BRCA2 mutations have increased in European populations. And so the combination of these two increasing likely also contributes to a higher risk of breast cancer in these populations.
And so to wrap up our presentation, some key points from our presentation include increased caloric intake and decreased energy expenditure have led to an increase in obesity rates, which is a risk factor for breast cancer, as we learned in the introduction. Then what we learned in the popular article is that staying active can help reduce the risk of getting breast cancer. Our first scientific paper stated that increased levels of physical activity are associated with higher levels of global DNA methylation, which in turn decreases the risk of getting breast cancer in adults, and that CPG epigenetic changes are heritable, thus affecting mammal evolution. And then finally, in our second scientific paper, in women with mutations in BRCA1 and BRCA2, increased levels of exercise during adolescence led to significantly decreased risk of breast cancer pre-menopause. However, no significant relationship was found in general breast cancer trends. Thank you.